It's been a time of tumult on Wall Street at the hands of the White House.
China, 67%. European Union, 39%. Vietnam, 90%. Taiwan, 64%. We're going to charge them 32%.
U.S. President Donald Trump made his plans on tariffs known from the campaign trail. But it still took the world by surprise, sweeping global markets into chaos.
Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. Oh, look at Cambodia, 97%. United Kingdom, 10%. South Africa, 60%, 30%.
Then, with the announcement of a 90-day pause, things calmed down. Trump took to his Truth Social with messages like, "Be cool."
I know what the hell I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. And you know what I'm doing too. That's why you vote for me.
But that hasn't done much for perhaps the greatest fear among the business-minded and the general public, the possibility of a recession. We've heard about quote-unquote recession indicators, particularly as they pertain to the US. But here in the Middle East, prospects might not be so grim. From The National, this is Business Extra, and I'm your host, Salim As-Saeed, coming to you from our Abu Dhabi studio. We've heard so much about Trump's sweeping tariffs. Today, taking you through the basis of recession fears, what that means for markets, and ultimately, what it means for consumers. We've heard the varied theories of recession indicators. We've got the lipstick index.
All kinds of economic indicators to predict the markets. The S&P 500, the ISM, the VIX. But what about the lipstick index?
Where consumers spend on smaller luxury items like lipsticks and avoid larger spends.
The buy now, pay later app Klarna.
There are the new options to pay for food deliveries in installments.
DoorDash. The company said DoorDash customers will be able to split their payments at checkout into 4 interest-free installments or defer the payments to a later date.
A recession is generally defined by a fall in GDP in 2 consecutive quarters. We can also look toward oil prices and rates of unemployment. International Monetary Fund Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva earlier this month said the global economy is expected to avoid a recession this year, despite the uncertainty surrounding tariffs. But at the same time, the IMF is also expected to raise its inflation forecast for some countries because of tariffs. Although Mr. Trump has held back on added tariffs for most countries, he has intensified his trade war with China.
Look, the president has made his position on China quite clear, although I do have an additional statement that he just shared with me in the Oval Office. The ball is in China's court. China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. Washington has hit China with tariffs totaling up to 145%, while Beijing has responded with duties of 125%. Unlike the US, the Middle East might actually get some buoyancy from this trade war. China has a long history of trade with the US, one that's been the main target of Trump's criticism. He said his Liberty Day tariffs, including and especially those on China, are meant to steer the US economy towards self-sufficiency. The tariff exchange between the US and China, reciprocal, retaliatory, and reciprocal again, have made one thing certain: China's got to look elsewhere for business.
There are several dimensions we should consider. One is the impact on Chinese imports to the GCC markets.
That's Arash Raisinejad. He's a visiting scholar at the Department of Government in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. He's here to tell us about the mechanics of all this.
As you know, most GCC countries are major importers of Chinese consumer goods, electronics, industrial equipment, and construction materials. If U.S. tariffs raise the price of Chinese goods in the American market, as it could, Chinese producers, I think, may seek to redirect surplus products to alternative markets, especially to the GCC countries.
So, China turns to the Middle East.
This could play out in 2 ways. One, prices may drop in GCC markets as Chinese suppliers attempt to attract new buyers and find new markets. China is a strong competitor to the US in both consumer and infrastructure markets across the GCC. If tariffs push Chinese firms to offer more attractive deals abroad, GCC countries may benefit from better pricing or terms in sectors like construction, telecommunication, and technology. This could put additional pressure on U.S. firms trying to maintain or expand their regional presence. But at the same time, countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and to some Qatar, whose relationship with the US are strategic, may come under subtle or overt pressure in a second Trump's terms.
They've also got a history, although relatively newer than that of the US and China. China's need for oil is satisfied by oil-rich countries here in the region, and the dynamic there is part of what's at stake globally.
If I want to shed light on the roots of tariff war, I think we need to think about the tariff war as a decisive step in reshaping the global geoeconomic power structure. So it's not a superficial competition.
But there's a caveat. Even for the Middle East, consumers in the long run could have to contend with higher prices on another key front.
Global supply chain disruption and increased shipping costs could lead to price hikes for end consumers. So it has two paradoxical impacts. It's a good opportunity for GCC markets and companies to cooperate with the Chinese. But at the same time, because of the disruption in a global supply chain, there would be a kind of increased shipping cost that might lead to price hikes for the consumers in GCC. So there is a ups and downs at the same time. But in a longer term, or let's say medium term, I think it depends on the capacity of the GCC markets to make a balance between Chinese and Americans. And also it depends on President Trump's geoeconomic, or let's say economic trade war with China. The longer the trade war or tariff war, I think the worse for the GCC markets, because they cannot make a balance between Chinese and the US at the same time. Fortunately, there are a bunch of, let's say, hawkish officials around President Trump who wants to put pressure on the GCC markets, any markets, to choose either between China or America.
Meanwhile, GCC-based companies have an opportunity to mitigate risk by tailoring their own strategies around the US and China.
I think smart companies in GCC might continue or might choose a more resilient strategy to make a balance between China and US. So there might be a kind of, let's say, good cop, bad cop for both China and the US, which means the companies, there are a bunch of companies just work with China, the other one just work with the US or maybe Europe. But at the same time, there would be a kind of companies that could make a balance between both two and getting discount from Chinese, at the same time keeping negotiations with the Americans. If they pushed to choose just between China and the America, as I mentioned, that there are a bunch of hawkish officers close around to the President Trump, to put pressure on companies to choose just between China and US. I think in that situation, there would be a specific role that companies might work with either China or the US. In a construction, I think the GCC markets might work with the Chinese in comparing to the Americans. While, for example, in the digital and technology, they look at the US. But in a long term, I think they have capacity to take a resilient strategy, making balance between China and America at the same time.
We'll hear from one of our reporters on what consumers have been saying. But first, a quick break.
Are you looking for deeper insights into the biggest news stories shaping the Middle East?
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip.
Listen to Beyond the Headlines, a weekly current affairs podcast from the National News in Abu Dhabi.
Surrender is not an option.
We break down the news and bring you in-depth analysis and expert perspectives on everything from regional power shifts to ongoing conflicts, giving you the full picture behind the events shaping the Arab region. Listen to Beyond the Headlines every Friday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back with Deepni Nair, personal finance reporter here at The National. She's been talking to people here in the UAE about the mood around Trump's tariffs. Deepti, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Salim. It's my pleasure.
You've been speaking to business owners, regular consumers, and so many others around the country. What are you hearing?
Yeah, based on my conversations, I think the biggest impact of the US tariffs has been on stock market investors owing to the mayhem caused by President Donald Trump.
Another big drop in the stock market today. All the major averages tumbling close to 2.5%.
Almost $10 trillion was wiped off global equities after the tariff announcement. So many UAE investors I spoke to experienced a massive drop in the value of their investment portfolios.
Investors are alarmed. They're really alarmed here at the
because the tariff trouble dented the value of their technology and AI stocks. People spoke to me about how their stocks in companies like Nvidia, for instance, saw a significant drop in market value, almost down by a whopping 30%, and this directly affected their portfolio performance.
And from those conversations you've had, what have been the tangible effects of Trump's tariffs so far?
While most consumers I spoke to, they were worried that tariffs will have a much more longer lasting impact than the stock market correction. Business owners are preparing for potential ripple effects from the global tariff row. They feel that the rising uncertainty around business sentiment and the interconnectedness of supply chains could lead to price increases in some categories, and they worry that this could lead to panic in business and reduction in spending across the board.
But I want to get a sense from you of what is the feeling you're getting from speaking to consumers or business owners. Are they worried? I feel like a lot of people don't know what's to come, and I'm wondering what is the sense that you're gathering from them when you speak to them?
When I spoke to consumers, some of them who directly import goods from the US, they were quite worried. And they told me that they've already started hoarding some products, such as medication, that they import from the US. So this was a feeling among consumers I spoke to. Whereas for business owners, like I mentioned, they're still waiting for the ripple effects to come through. And they are in a wait and watch mode as of now. They haven't started panicking just as yet.
That's interesting. Are they directing their spending differently as of yet, or is that still too early?
Yeah, they think it's still too early and they're waiting to see, especially after the 90-day pause in tariffs, they're waiting to assess the situation as and when things change. But they didn't speak of any changes in their purchasing behavior or spend as yet.
Okay, so there's still hope in their minds in terms of things getting better. But compared to people in the US, how does the effect on consumers here compare to that felt in the US?
Consumers in the US are much more worried because they feel this will have a direct impact on prices of goods and services.
That's impacting the wallets of every American. The cost of eggs skyrocketing, gas prices on the rise as well.
So people have already started stocking up on a lot of goods in supermarkets before inflation begins to bite. In particular, electronic products in the US are set for price rises because these make up a big chunk of what is imported from China. And also there have been reports of how toys are set to get more expensive because, again, 80% of all toys in the US are made in China, as well as Americans are also set to experience price rises in clothing and footwear as a result of the tariffs.
And the price of gas is always something that people are concerned about. Do you see that, whether in the US or in the region, something that they should be worried of?
Not yet, because I think oil and gas has been exempt from the tariffs just as yet. So I think it's too soon to expect an impact.
And you mentioned that the 90-day pause is giving consumers some relief. Is that something that they should feel comfort in, or can it really mitigate any of these effects?
It's too soon to say whether the 90-day pause on the tariffs will mitigate the effect on consumers as well as businesses. But the most immediate effect has been experienced by stock investors because markets globally rallied following the announcement. Gold investors are, however, at an advantage as prices of the yellow metal have hit a record high amid the trade tensions.
Looking forward, can you describe what's next? Are you able to give any sense of a timeline of how you see behavior changing within the next few weeks of consumers or small business owners alike?
I think since the 90-day pause is in effect, but the 10% tariffs are still in effect, people are still waiting and watching. They're cautious, and there is talk of a global recession. So people are still wary, and some companies they've put their hiring plans on hold, expansion plans on hold. So everyone's just waiting and watching to see if Trump can manage to get some of these countries back to the negotiating table to rework their trade agreements.
So along with the tariffs being on pause, so are people in terms of making any big moves.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your reporting. We're just about a couple of weeks into Trump's pause on tariffs, but worries haven't completely subsided. And in the coming days, with predictions and indicators abound, economists and consumers alike will probably still have changing answers to the open-ended questions about what's next. That's all for this episode of Business Extra. Make sure to spread the word about the podcast and subscribe wherever you stream. This episode was produced by Yasmin Al-Taji. Our editor is Duat Farid. Our audio engineer is Arthur Edison. And I've been your host, Salim As-Saeed.